Frost had already soaked through Catherine Ivanov's gloves when she nearly slipped between two stopped carriages on Bond Street. One hand clamped over Lady Harrow's jewelled reticule beneath her shawl, the other braced against a wheel slick with rain and city grime. The street shone black under the lamps. Hooves struck sparks at the far corner. Coach doors opened and closed in bursts of light and laughter that did not belong to her world. She moved in the narrow corridor left for servants, close enough to silk hems and polished boots to hear the rustle of expensive fabric and the soft contempt in passing voices. A woman in emerald satin turned her head, looked Catherine from wet hair to split shoes, and looked away with the practised indifference reserved for furniture and the poor. A boy carrying hat boxes glanced at her limp and slowed, as if he might offer help, then saw the Harrow crest worked in gold thread on the reticule clasp, and kept walking. That was the shape of her existence in London now, seen clearly by strangers, denied plainly by family. Rain ran down the back of her neck and under the collar of her thin mantle. Her dark hair clung to her throat. Her eyes burned from the candle smoke she had sat in since dawn, mending ribbons for gowns she would never wear. Yet she kept her pace because Lady Harrow had said the words with that soft lavender calm she used before punishment. "Do not be late. If the clasp is scratched, you will eat tomorrow." By the time Catherine reached the awning of Halford House and passed the reticule to a footman who did not thank her, the seams of her left shoe had opened enough to let cold water lap at her stocking with every step. She waited in the rain while the household carriages took Lady Harrow and both Miss Harrows from one ballroom to the next, because horses, like candles and coal, were never wasted on Catherine. The first hour stripped sensation from her fingers. The second brought it back in needles. She stood beside the service entrance with Lady Harrow's spare cloak folded over her arm and watched London move at a speed she was never permitted to match. Gentlemen in great coats crossed the pavement without seeing the servants who made their evenings possible. Maids ran errands with baskets tucked under wet aprons. Porters cursed at traffic and were ignored by everyone with a title. At intervals, a coachman from the Harrow household appeared long enough to bark an order, then vanished into steam and horse breath. "Do not crease the velvet. You will carry this to the rear door at Devonshire. Lady Harrow says you are to wait." Hunger came in predictable waves now, no longer sharp, only hollow and patient. She had eaten dry bread at noon in the attic and nothing since. When she shifted weight from one foot to the other, pain climbed from heel to knee where the old bruise had never entirely faded. "Stair rail," she would say if asked. "Door edge." Clumsy, always clumsy. She had practised those answers until they fell from her mouth without thought. Near midnight, two gentlemen leaving a house on Berkeley Square paused when they saw her sway and catch herself against a stone post. One murmured, "Poor creature," not unkindly, and dropped a coin toward her as if she were a beggar. Catherine bent, picked up the coin and held it out to him with a steadier hand than she felt. "You are mistaken, sir." He stared, embarrassed by her accent and her diction, by the legal precision of her vowels that marked a past she could not afford to display. His companion laughed once, low and cruel. "A proud one, then." They moved on. The coin glinted in the gutter until rain carried it to the drain. By the time the last carriage rolled home, dawn had turned the edges of the sky from iron to pearl, and Catherine climbed the back stair to the attic in silence so complete she could hear each thread in her wet sleeve brush against the banister. Her room sat under the eaves where the roof tiles rattled in wind, and the cold rose through the floorboards as if the house itself rejected her weight. No fire, no coal bucket, a narrow cot with one blanket gone thin at the centre. She removed her gloves, finger by finger, peeling wool from raw skin, and set them beside the candle stub she was not allowed to trim until it burned below the brass line of the holder. The mirror nailed to the wall gave her only fragments. One large, dark eye, ringed with exhaustion, a pale cheek, the curve of her mouth set hard against trembling. She unlaced her shoes and saw what she had already felt for hours. Damp stockings rubbed through at the heel and the skin beneath red and split. She dried her feet with the corner of her petticoat, then wrapped them again and sat at the small table that had once belonged to her father. Torn hems waited in a heap. A bodice seam had parted. One silk overskirt carried a stain of spilled punch and candle wax. Lady Harrow would notice every flaw by breakfast if Catherine did not finish. Needle, thread, pull, knot. The work demanded precision at the same time her hands refused to steady. Twice she pricked herself and sucked the sting away before it touched the fabric. The house below began to stir, first with kitchen doors, then with distant voices, then with the scent of coffee and butter that climbed the stair and stopped at her threshold as if barred by law. She stitched until the sky went white. At 8, a maid from the second floor brought up a tray and set it down without meeting her eyes. One heel of bread, a cup of tea gone pale from too much water, no sugar. Lady Harrow says the emerald gown must be pressed before noon, the maid said. And then, after a pause that almost became kindness, she says the weather has made everyone irritable. Catherine nodded, because refusal had no function in this house. When the maid left, Catherine sat with the bread in both hands and forced herself to eat slowly, so her empty stomach would not rebel. Crumbs stuck to the calloused pads of her fingers. She brushed them into her palm and swallowed those too. Then she unlocked the lower drawer of her father's table, with a key she wore on a string at her neck, and withdrew the account ledgers wrapped in plain linen. This labour belonged to no one else, and because it belonged to no one else, it was the only labour she trusted. Columns of figures marched down each page in her neat hand, ink dark and exact, the way Captain Ivanov had taught her when she was 11 and proud to sit at his elbow while he balanced freight manifests against port dues. She copied yesterday's receipts from memory first, then checked them against household vouchers she had borrowed and returned before Lady Harrow woke. Lamp oil, lace repair, wine deliveries, coal allotments that never reached the attic. She noted each discrepancy in the margin in a script so disciplined it hid the shaking in her wrist. Numbers had a mercy social rank, did not. They remained what they were. They could be altered on paper, but not erased in truth. When she finished a page, she laid blotting paper over the ink and pressed flat with both palms until the pain in her cracked skin made her jaw tighten. Outside, carriage wheels resumed on wet stones. Inside, the housekeeper called instructions from the corridor. Catherine turned to a new column and kept writing. By the second week of November, her days had acquired the hard repetition of punishment done well. She walked where horses rode. She carried jewels she could never claim. She ate what remained after servants had eaten what remained after family had dined. She mended the evidence of pleasure and then stood outside while that pleasure continued under chandeliers. At noon, Lady Harrow swept into the attic in a cloud of lavender and rustling silk, inspected the repaired gowns, and lifted one hem between two fingers, as if touching something contaminated. "You missed a stitch." Catherine saw at once that she had not, that the line was straight and strong, but Lady Harrow preferred correction to truth. "I shall redo it," Catherine said. Lady Harrow's gaze moved to the ledgers on the table, to the careful rows of numbers, to the blotter folded square. "You spend a remarkable amount of time with dead men's habits," she said. "No gentleman values arithmetic in a woman. It hardens the face." The insult landed where it was meant to land, on the old wound named plain, always plain. And Catherine felt the familiar heat rise in her throat. She swallowed it. Lady Harrow smiled without warmth and adjusted one pearl at her ear, a pearl Catherine remembered from her mother's dowry case before it had been opened and emptied and declared necessary. "You will attend with us tonight as companion only," she said. "Speak when spoken to. Keep to the wall. If anyone asks, you are fortunate to be under my protection." She turned at the door and added, almost gently, "Do not force me to remind you how quickly that can change." When she was gone, Catherine stood very still beside the table until the scent of lavender thinned and vanished. Then she drew the ledgers back toward her, aligned the pages, and set her pen to the next line while rain began again at the window, thin and relentless, tapping the glass like knuckles that would not stop. Rain traced the warped window pane in thin, uneven lines, and Catherine kept her pen moving until the ink blurred, and she realised her eyes had filled without permission. She set the nib aside at once, and pressed thumb and forefinger hard against the bridge of her nose. Tears were wasteful. Paper was not. She reached for the linen-wrapped packet in the drawer instead, untied the knot, and drew out the map her father had carried on his last voyage, the edges softened by years of handling, the coastlines marked in his square, disciplined hand. Captain Ivanov had taught her figures the way other fathers taught dancing. Weight first, then measure, then value. Never trust a sum without checking the line above it. Never trust a line without checking the signature beneath it. The rain that morning sounded almost like the rain that had struck the docks 6 years earlier, when she and her mother had stood under a leaking awning and watched men unload cargo that was not his, while the harbour clerk, with ink on his cuffs, said the ship had gone down south of Biscay, and there would be no body returned, no grave, no final prayer over a marked stone, only a trunk sent weeks later with his sextant, his watch, 2 shirts still smelling faintly of salt and tar, and a sheaf of legal papers bound in twine. She had been 19 then, old enough to understand the language in the solicitor's office, and young enough to believe language could still protect her. The will had named her beneficiary of the school lands near Whitcomb and of the investment accounts linked to freight contracts. It had named trustees and dates and conditions. It had contained a codicil, the solicitor said, but that page was not in the packet delivered to Chambers. She remembered the exact silence that followed, the one that made voices in the next room sound indecently cheerful. Her mother had gone very still. Her glove had tightened around Catherine's wrist. 3 days later, Mr. Harrow began calling. He was courteous. He was solvent. He wore grief like a black cravat tied too neatly to be sincere. By Michaelmas, her mother had married him, and Catherine had told herself stability was not betrayal, that survival sometimes arrived in unwelcome forms. Mr. Harrow died in less than a year from a fever that hollowed him out in weeks, and his widow inherited the house, the title, and, by practical arrangement rather than legal right, the guardianship of her new husband's stepdaughter. Lady Harrow had kissed Catherine's cheek at the funeral and said, "You are safe with me now." The words had settled over Catherine like frost. The first winter under Lady Harrow's roof taught her the architecture of controlled hunger. Breakfast could disappear as punishment for speaking too slowly. Supper could be delayed until midnight because a ribbon had not been pressed to the correct sheen. Coal could be assigned to every room except the attic, and still be entered in the household book as distributed equally by floor. Lady Harrow never shouted in front of company. That was not her style. She corrected. She reclassified. She narrated Catherine's life in polished tones until the false version sounded almost benevolent. "My poor ward is delicate," she told guests, while sending Catherine on errands in sleet. "She is so grateful for guidance," she told priests and matrons while locking the pantry. "She has no head for practical matters," she told solicitors while sliding unsigned papers to the sideboard and directing Catherine to carry tea instead of reading what was being discussed. Catherine learned quickly that cruelty could wear pearls and smell of lavender water and still leave marks no physician was invited to examine. If bruises showed at her wrist, Lady Harrow would tilt her head and ask, "Have you grown clumsy again?" And Catherine would answer, "Yes, my lady," because contradiction brought consequences that lasted longer than the sentence. The two Miss Harrows copied this method with the bright eagerness of girls praised for wit. Miss Eliza would hold up one of Catherine's old ribbons and say, "This blue improves me, does it not? It was wasted in the attic." Miss Anne would take a book from Catherine's bedside, leaf through pages as if searching for stains, then carry it downstairs without asking, and return it weeks later with the spine bent and candle wax dropped along the margin. They took in increments at first: gloves, pins, a winter shawl that had belonged to her mother, then larger things with no pretence. The walnut dressing table from Catherine's room moved to Eliza's chambers one morning, while Catherine was sent to market. Her father's brass compass vanished from the drawer where she had hidden it, and reappeared as a curiosity on a drawing-room shelf, praised by callers who admired the Harrow collection. Her dowry pearls, the 6 matched strands catalogued in her mother's hand, were sold within a fortnight of Mr. Harrow's funeral. Catherine found the jeweller's receipt by chance in a stack of unpaid bills and folded it into her sleeve before anyone could burn it. When she asked Lady Harrow, carefully and in private, whether there had been a misunderstanding, Lady Harrow smiled with patient contempt. "Your dowry purchased this household's comfort," she said. "You are welcome to enjoy the comfort from the attic." By the spring of the following year, the pattern had hardened into law inside those walls. Catherine rose before dawn to mend and copy and account for expenditures she did not authorise. She accompanied Lady Harrow in public as unpaid companion, always near enough to fetch a fan, never near enough to join conversation unless spoken to directly by someone too polite to ignore her existence. In private, she became labour: dressmaker, bookkeeper, courier, seamstress, scapegoat. Lady Harrow discovered that Catherine's father had taught her legal script and double-entry methods, and for one brief week, Catherine thought usefulness might soften treatment. Usefulness sharpened it instead. Bills began arriving with inflated totals and missing seals. Debtors called at hours calculated to humiliate. Tradesmen grew bolder when wages were delayed, then apologised to Lady Harrow and glared at Catherine as if she had withheld payment from her own pocket. Whenever questions arose, Lady Harrow turned toward Catherine with serene surprise and said, "Did you not attend to that?" in whatever room offered the widest audience. In July, during a reception crowded enough to guarantee witnesses, Lady Harrow struck Catherine's hand with a silver fan because a glove button had split, then laughed lightly and told the room, "She startles like a colt. We are civilising her." Laughter followed from women who had never seen the attic. Catherine kept her face still. She bent and picked up the fallen button. She finished fastening Lady Harrow's glove. That night she ate crust and tea in darkness, and wrote every expense from memory by candle stump, because the official household ledger had begun to diverge from reality in ways too precise to be error. The year 1819 had been entered as loss from bad harvest and maritime volatility. The figures did not support it. Coal purchases were over-reported by a third, linen orders duplicated, repairs billed twice, 1 invoice paid, 1 outstanding. A debt note appeared against the Whitcomb school lands in a hand she did not recognise, countersigned with a trustee mark that had died with her father. She copied each discrepancy into a private ledger and hid it beneath a false board under her cot. By the second week of October, she had begun checking the same 4 columns every night, testing whether the irregularities moved with chance or with design. They moved with design, always in Lady Harrow's favour, always against assets tied to Catherine's name. Now, with rain tapping the attic glass and the house preparing below for another evening of silk and chandeliers, the weight of those years sat in her shoulders as tangibly as wet wool. She spread 3 books across the table in careful order: the household account, her private copy, and her father's old ledger from the last complete year before his death. The differences were no longer small. They had become a scaffold built around her life, the false debt used to justify her dependence, the missing codicil used to cloud her claim, the sold pearls reframed as necessary sacrifice, the unpaid school taxes entered as her negligence. Even language had been converted into instrument: ward when pity was useful, companion when display was required, burden when punishment needed an audience. She heard footsteps on the stair and closed the private ledger in one motion, sliding blotter and mending basket over it before the latch lifted. Miss Eliza entered without knocking, smelling of violet powder and impatience, a length of silver net thrown over one arm. "Mother says you are to alter this before we leave," she said, dropping the fabric so it spilled across the figures Catherine had just checked. "And do not make me broad at the shoulder. You do that when you are sulking." Catherine rose because remaining seated invited comment she could not afford. "I do not sulk, Miss Eliza." Eliza's eyes narrowed, delighted by the smallest resistance. "No, you count. It is worse." She glanced at the closed ledger. "Still pretending numbers will rescue you?" Catherine met her gaze and kept her voice level. "Numbers do not rescue anyone. They testify." Eliza laughed, sharp and pretty. "To whom?" She gathered her skirts, already turning toward the door. "No one listens to attic testimony." When she had gone, Catherine stood with the silver net in her hands and listened to the house breathe around her. Doors opening, servants calling, a carriage rolling into the mews. She threaded her needle. She set the first stitch. She did not pray for mercy any more. She prayed for accuracy, for timing, for one room where truth might be read aloud before it could be silenced. She set the second stitch, drew it tight, and heard the crash from the street hard enough to rattle the window latch in its frame. Voices rose at once. A horse screamed. Then came a shout from the corridor below, a woman's thin cry, and the unmistakable crack of wood under weight. Catherine was already on her feet. The silver net slid from her lap. Needle and thread spilled across the table and struck the boards like sleet. She crossed the attic in 3 strides, caught the mantle hanging by the door, and ran down the back stair while the house shook with movement, footmen swearing, doors slamming, Lady Harrow calling for her daughters not to step outside. The service passage stank of wet wool and lamp oil. Someone collided with her shoulder and kept going. At the rear door she saw the courtyard turn to black slurry under rain. One carriage angled wrong against the curb. A lantern shattered in pieces. A bay horse rearing with both front legs high, while its driver fought the reins and lost ground inch by inch on the slick stone. A young groom in Halford livery lay half under the carriage step, conscious and gasping, one trouser leg trapped beneath the twisted bracket where the lamp had torn away. 2 footmen stood a yard off, hands lifted and useless, waiting for orders from men who were not yet close enough to give them. Catherine dropped Lady Harrow's cloak where she stood and ran into the rain. Water hit her face like thrown gravel. Her bad shoe folded under her at the first rut. She recovered, slid, and reached the groom just as the horse came down and jerked the traces again. "Hold his head clear," she shouted to the nearest footman, and when he did not move, she grabbed his sleeve and dragged him to his knees beside her. The groom's breath came sharp and high. His hands clawed at the stone. She bent low and spoke directly into his ear. "Look at me. You will breathe with me. Slow!" He obeyed because pain left no room for pride. She worked her fingers under the bent bracket, found the catch that still held and yanked. It did not give. She braced both feet and pulled again. Metal shrieked. The bracket snapped free and she hauled the young man clear by his coat while the footman steadied his shoulders at last. A dark-haired gentleman appeared from the far side of the carriage, coat soaked through, one gloved hand pressed against the wheel rim, as if he had held it in place by force. He was tall enough to seem carved out of the rain itself, broad through the shoulders, jaw rigid, the old scar along that jaw pale and tight against wet skin. His voice cut through the courtyard like steel striking stone. "Leave him! My men will tend to it." Catherine had already torn a strip from her petticoat hem. She wrapped the cloth around the groom's bleeding forearm, tied a knot with her teeth when her fingers slipped, and looked up once, rain running into her eyes. "Your men are watching him drown on dry land, sir." For one suspended beat, no one moved. Then the gentleman stepped forward, boots splashing, gaze locked on her face, as if he were matching it against a memory or a dossier he had not expected to find in a servant's yard. Behind him someone shouted, "Make room for his grace!" And the title landed like a dropped weight in Catherine's chest. Adrian Vale, Duke of Norwood, veteran of the peninsula, the man every drawing-room measured itself against, and none could warm. An hour had not passed since she had prayed for one room where truth might be spoken before it was buried, and now she knelt in mud with torn skirts in the Duke's shadow, and realised safety had not been granted, only exchanged for a sharper form of danger. Norwood crouched opposite her without hesitation, one knee in the water, and took the groom's wrist to count the pulse himself. His hands were steady. His face was not kind, but it was precise. "Name?" he asked the young man. "Thomas Reed, your grace." "Can you feel your feet, Reed?" "Yes, your grace." "Good. Keep speaking." He lifted his head. "Surgeon, now." A coachman ran. Norwood's gaze returned to Catherine and travelled, unsparing, from her rain-plastered hair to the split seam of her shoe, to the raw skin across her knuckles, where thread had worn the top layer away. "You are limping," he said. "You have an untreated bruise at the knee. Your right hand is swollen. You are shaking." The blunt catalogue burned hotter than insult because it was true and spoken aloud in front of men trained never to notice. Catherine tightened the knot on Reed's bandage and rose too quickly. Pain shot up her leg. She caught the carriage door to keep from falling. "I am well enough." "Liar!" The single word was quiet and final. He stood as she steadied, towering over the overturned lantern and the broken wood, rain cutting silver lines down the shoulders of his coat. "You are not bathing for pleasure in this weather, miss—" His eyes narrowed. "Ivanov!" She stared at him. She had never been presented to him. She had not danced within 20 feet of him. Her name should have passed him like any other unimportant fact in a crowded season. "You know me, your grace?" "I know the Harrow accounts," he said, as if that answered anything. He turned to the footman still kneeling beside Reed. "Inside. Warm blankets. Keep him awake until Mr. Fenwick arrives." The footman moved at once, relieved to obey. Lady Harrow reached the threshold just then, silk skirts lifted from the mud by outraged fingers. lavender arriving before her voice. Miss Eliza and Miss Anne hovered behind her, cloaks clasped at their throats, faces bright with alarm sharpened by curiosity. Lady Harrow saw Catherine's torn hem and wet hair, saw the Duke standing close enough that rain struck both their shoulders from the same angle, and arranged her expression into injured propriety. "Your Grace, what a calamity! My poor companion has no sense of boundaries when distressed. Catherine, step back at once." Catherine did not step back. Reed swayed on his feet between two servants. She put one hand on his elbow until they had him balanced. Norwood watched that hand, then looked at Lady Harrow with a levelness that made even the rain seem to pause. "Your companion acted while your household hesitated. She likely prevented a crushed chest." Lady Harrow's smile thinned. "She is impulsive. We do what we can with difficult gratitude." Norwood ignored the offered script. "Mr. Fenwick will examine her hand as well." Lady Harrow gave a soft laugh. "You are generous, Your Grace, but she is merely Miss Ivanoff." His answer came before the echo of her laugh died. "She is my cousin, Miss Ivanoff." Silence struck the courtyard harder than the crash had. Eliza's mouth parted. Anne looked to her mother for correction. Catherine felt the words like cold iron laid against skin. She turned to him fully, rain on her lashes, and said with careful clarity, "I am not your cousin, Your Grace." His eyes did not leave hers. "Not here," he said. "Not now." Lady Harrow recovered first. "How amusing! His Grace jests under pressure." Norwood spoke without looking at her. "I do not jest." Mr. Fenwick, short and breathless under an oilskin cape, arrived carrying his leather case and began issuing brisk instructions. Reed was guided inside. Catherine tried to withdraw to the wall and failed because Norwood shifted one step and blocked the angle. Up close, his presence was a physical fact she could not reason away. Cold rain rose as steam from his coat. The scar at his jaw tightened when he clenched his teeth, a pale line against weathered skin. His eyes were a hard winter colour, grey with blue buried deep, and focused on her with military concentration that made evasion feel childish. "Sit," he said. She remained standing. "I have duties." "Sit, Mister." Fenwick glanced between them and wisely pretended he heard only weather. Catherine lowered herself onto an upturned trunk by the doorway because her knee had begun to tremble, and she would not give Lady Harrow the spectacle of collapse. Fenwick took her right hand gently, turned it toward the lantern, and sucked air through his teeth. "Overuse and cold, no fracture, torn skin. You have stitched through pain for weeks." Lady Harrow interjected, sweet as poison in tea. "She insists on making herself useful, Doctor. It is quite impossible to stop her." Catherine looked straight ahead. Norwood's voice cut across Lady Harrow's with no increase in volume. "Bandage it." Fenwick obeyed. While the surgeon wrapped linen around her palm, Norwood removed his gloves one finger at a time, then held his left hand out. A shallow cut crossed the base of his thumb where the wheel iron had bitten through leather. "After her," he said. Fenwick hesitated. "Your Grace, that should be cleaned now." "After her?" Catherine turned despite herself. "You are bleeding." "So are half the men in London most days," he said. "Hold still." The command might have been meant for himself. It landed on her all the same. She held still. Fenwick tied off the bandage and stepped to Norwood at last. Lady Harrow watched with narrowed eyes, calculating at speed. The sisters whispered behind their gloves. Servants moved in and out, carrying blankets, broken lamp pieces, a bucket of sand for the slick stone. The courtyard had become a stage without anyone admitting it. Norwood did not flinch when antiseptic touched his cut. He kept his attention on Catherine as if the rest were administrative noise. "Why were you in the yard?" she answered, because refusal would read as guilt in Lady Harrow's retelling by midnight. "I was ordered to wait with a cloak." "In freezing rain?" "Yes, Your Grace." "For how long?" Lady Harrow answered for her. "You know how households function. Servants wait," Catherine said quietly. "I am not a servant." The words escaped before caution could restrain them. Eliza laughed under her breath. Lady Harrow's gaze sharpened to a knife edge. Norwood's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, gone before it formed. "No," he said, "you are not." He flexed his newly bandaged hand, then addressed Lady Harrow at last. "You will bring Miss Ivanoff into the Halford drawing-room tonight. She will not remain in service corridors again." Lady Harrow lifted her chin. "Your Grace, my family arrangements are not generally directed from outside." "They are when blood has been spilled at my wheel," he said, "and when negligence is public." Her nostrils flared. "You accuse my household." "I observe it." He stepped back from Fenwick, reclaimed his gloves, and gave the next order as if dictating terms of weather. At the first said, "I will request an introduction to my cousin. You will grant it." Catherine felt the old instinct rise, the one that corrected false entries in ink, no matter who had written them. "Your Grace, I have already said—" His gaze pinned her, unblinking. "Do not return alone, Miss Ivanoff." The sentence should have sounded like control. Instead, it sounded like a door barred from the inside while a storm struck the other side and begged to be admitted. Lady Harrow inclined her head, because refusal in open yard would cost too much. "As you wish." She did not mean it. Catherine could hear the future consequences in the softness of her tone. Norwood turned to leave, then paused and looked back once. Rain had eased to a fine mist that silvered his dark hair and sharpened the planes of his face. "Eat before you dress," he said. "You are faint." Lady Harrow answered brightly. She ate. Norwood's eyes remained on Catherine. "Did you?" She held his gaze for one beat too long, then said, "No, Your Grace." "Then eat." He strode toward his carriage, every step controlled, the yard opening for him, as if command itself moved the air. At the door he spoke to his driver without turning. "Set an extra rug in my coach. We will not leave anyone on foot tonight." He entered, and was gone into rain and lamplight. Lady Harrow waited until the carriage wheels passed the gate before she leaned close to Catherine, lavender and fury braided together. "You will remember your place inside, if not out here. If you humiliate me in that room, you will sign whatever paper I place before you by dawn." Catherine rose from the trunk, bandaged hand throbbing, skirt hem hanging in torn strips where she had ripped it for Reed. "Yes, my lady." The answer cost less than defiance in a courtyard full of witnesses. She bent to retrieve the cloak she had dropped at the first cry, wrung rain from its velvet edge, and followed Lady Harrow inside toward heat that did not feel like safety, carrying in her chest the Duke's impossible word, like a brand she had not consented to bear, cousin. She crossed the threshold on Lady Harrow's heels, and warmth struck her skin like a reprimand. Heat from the kitchen ranges moved through the passage in uneven waves. Wet wool steamed. Wax smoke curled along the ceiling. Servants ran past with armfuls of dry linen, eyes lowered, mouths tight with the fear that follows public disorder. Catherine kept her gaze on the flagstones and tried to quiet the pounding in her knee. The bandage on her hand had already begun to stiffen where rainwater thinned the dressing. Lady Harrow did not slow. "Upstairs, at once. Eliza cannot be kept waiting because you developed a taste for heroics." Catherine stopped beside the sideboard where spare candles were kept and turned before caution could tame her tongue. "Thomas Reed may lose that arm if the splint shifts. Mr. Fenwick asked for clean strips and boiled water. Lady Harrow's face changed by degrees. First disbelief, then cold delight. "You presume to quote instructions to me in my own house." "I presume nothing," Catherine said. "I heard him." Miss Anne gave a soft laugh from the stair. "She sounds like a governess in a penny pamphlet." Lady Harrow took one step closer, silk whispering against the stone. "You will go upstairs. You will change. You will remember that your value tonight is silence." Catherine inclined her head, because refusal in the open corridor would buy only spectacle. "Yes, my lady." Then she added, with deliberate obedience sharpened into formality, "I shall fetch the water first, since delay might be remarked upon by his Grace's physician." Lady Harrow's mouth tightened. That small invocation of outside authority did what pleading never could. 2 minutes, she said. "No longer." Catherine moved before the permission could be withdrawn. She took a copper kettle from the hook, crossed the kitchen where scullery maids turned to stare at her torn hem, and filled it from the boiler. Steam burned her wrist. She did not flinch. On the shelf above the chopping block sat a heel of yesterday's loaf meant for crumbs. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it beneath her mantle without asking. Hunger could wait. Shock could not. Thomas Reed lay in the old steward's room near the mews, coat cut open, boots off, one leg elevated on folded blankets. He looked younger indoors than he had in rain, no more than 17. His lips had lost colour. Mr. Fenwick was binding the forearm with practised speed, while a housemaid held a lamp too high and shook hard enough to rattle the glass chimney. "Lower it," Catherine said softly to the maid. "He must not squint into flame." Fenwick glanced up, saw the kettle and gave one brisk nod. "Good, set it there. We must clean the mud from the wound again. Reed, stay awake." Reed tried to answer and swallowed a groan instead. Catherine poured water into the basin. Her right hand protested with a sharp pulse beneath the bandage, so she used her left to wring clean cloths. She worked without ceremony. Mud first, then grit from the cut edges, then dry linen. When Reed's teeth began to chatter, she took the bread from her mantle, broke it, and held one piece to his hand. "Eat," she said, "slowly." His eyes flicked toward Fenwick, as if permission were required. Fenwick did not look up. "Do as she says." Reed obeyed. The door opened and shut behind them. Boots on stone. A pause. Catherine assumed it was another servant sent to hover and did not turn. She was adjusting the splint when Fenwick straightened abruptly. "Your Grace!" Only then did she look. Norwood stood in the doorway without cloak, his coat changed, his dark hair still damp at the temples. He filled the frame in a way that made the narrow room seem smaller than it was. His left hand remained wrapped where Fenwick had dressed it. He did not step in at once. He watched Catherine's hands, then Reed's face, then the half loaf on the blanket. "Status," he said. "Concussion mild, arm laceration deep but clean. No obvious fracture now that swelling is down," Fenwick replied. "He needs rest and supervision through the night." Norwood's gaze moved to Reed. "You heard him?" "Yes, Your Grace," Reed whispered. "Good. You report to my stables when Fenwick clears you. Halford House can invoice me for the week's wages." Reed's eyes widened. "Your Grace, I—" "Recover first." Catherine returned her attention to the splint and tied the last knot. She could feel Norwood's stare settle again on her profile, heavy as a hand at the nape of her neck. "Why are you not upstairs dressing?" he asked. She did not look up. "Because he was shivering." "He has staff." He had a lamp held at his eyes. Silence stretched. Fenwick coughed into his fist, chose prudence, and busied himself with the medicine case. Norwood stepped fully into the room at last. He spoke to Fenwick, but his eyes stayed on Catherine. "See that Reed receives broth, not brandy, and laudanum only, if fever rises." "Yes, your Grace." Norwood inclined his head once and turned away. At the threshold he said low and flat, "You have 1/4 hour, Miss Ivanoff. Then you eat." The door closed behind him. Fenwick tied off the final bandage and exhaled through his nose. "He gives orders as other men breathe." Catherine rinsed blood-streaked cloth in the basin until the water clouded pink and then clear. "He gives them accurately." Fenwick's mouth twitched. Not quite amusement. That too. By the time the long-case clock in the rear hall struck 9, Catherine was in the attic again with Eliza's silver nets spread across her lap, her own wet dress exchanged for the least frayed muslin she possessed. Mrs. Davies, the cook, had sent up a chipped bowl of broth without a word and pretended not to see when Catherine drank it standing over the washstand. The warmth steadied her enough to lace her bodice with one hand and teeth. She pinned her dark hair at the nape. Strands escaped at once. She left them. There was no mirror large enough to improve what the house had already judged. Lady Harrow's earlier demand, hissed after Norwood first left the yard, with papers to be signed by dawn, still rang in Catherine's ears. A knock came, sharp and peremptory. Not waiting for answer, Lady Harrow entered carrying a folded document and a pen-case. "You will sign this before we leave." Catherine set down the hairpin. "What is it?" "A simple statement for the Halford solicitor. It confirms that the groom stepped backward into the carriage trace through his own carelessness, and that no member of this household failed in duty." Catherine held out her unbandaged hand. "May I read it?" Lady Harrow's smile was patient and poisonous. "Do not be theatrical. Your hand is not steady enough for legal prose." Catherine reached anyway. Lady Harrow let the pages fall into her palm, as if dropping refuse. Catherine read. The lines were elegant. The lies were total. It named Reed intoxicated. It named Norwood's driver reckless. It stated that Catherine had remained inside and had seen nothing directly. At the bottom, a blank waited for her signature. Witnessed by Harrow household, dated, sealed. Her stomach tightened. "This is false." "It is protective." "It is perjury." Lady Harrow moved closer until lavender filled the cold air of the attic. "Do not use legal words to me. You learned that language at my table. I learned it at my father's." Lady Harrow's eyes hardened. "Your father is dead. My name keeps a roof over you. Sign." Catherine laid the paper on the table and flattened the curling edge with careful fingers. "No." The word left the room clean and unadorned. Lady Harrow's breath caught once, sharp with disbelief. "As I warned you, by dawn you will be engaged to Mr. Bryce and gone to Yorkshire before the week turns." Catherine lifted her chin. "If you mean to sell me, do it without my handwriting attached to a lie." The slap came fast, not hard enough to knock her down, hard enough to ring in her ear and leave heat spreading across her cheek. Catherine did not raise a hand to the mark. She kept her eyes on Lady Harrow's face and held herself upright by force of will. Lady Harrow spoke through clenched teeth. "You will regret this." A voice from the doorway answered before Catherine could. "She will not." Both women turned. Norwood stood just beyond the threshold, one shoulder against the frame, expression unreadable. Behind him, at a respectful distance, a footman held a salver with Lady Harrow's gloves and fan. The servant's eyes were fixed firmly on the floor. He had heard enough to remember every syllable for life and repeat none of them. Lady Harrow recovered with admirable speed. "Your Grace, we were discussing household records." Norwood glanced at the document on the table. Then discuss them with your solicitor in daylight. Miss Ivanov will sign nothing tonight. This concerns my staff. This concerns a collision involving my carriage. His tone did not rise. And a witness you attempted to falsify. Lady Harrow's nostrils flared. You accuse me under my own roof. I state what I heard under your roof. He stepped aside without entering, making space rather than demand. The coach is ready. We are late. He left as abruptly as he had appeared. Lady Harrow stood very still for 2 beats, then snatched the document from the table and folded it with precise violence. "Powder your cheek," she said to Catherine. "If anyone asks, you slipped." Catherine answered in the same measured register. "Yes, my lady." The Devonshire crush had not yet reached full density when they arrived, but the ballroom already burned with light. Chandeliers threw gold over mirrors and marble. Strings carried a waltz too elegant to match the hunger in Catherine's belly. Perfume, beeswax, wet wool, and champagne mingled in the air until breathing felt like swallowing someone else's life. Lady Harrow moved into the crowd at once, daughters in her wake, each rustle of silk a declaration of ownership she could not legally prove and had enforced for years. Catherine took her assigned place against the wall between 2 potted palms and kept her hands clasped to hide the bandage. People looked away. A baroness she recognised from 3 prior assemblies paused long enough to inspect her cheek, now dusted poorly with powder, and murmured to her companion, "Such unfortunate skin." The companion nodded, relieved to classify cruelty as complexion. Across the room, Norwood stood in conversation with 2 members of Parliament and a colonel with medals on his chest. He seemed carved out of colder material than everyone around him. Dark coat, white cravat tied with military severity, scar pale at the jaw. He did not look toward her. That should have eased her. It did not. A quarter-hour later, a Bow Street runner entered with the house major domo, plain coat among brocade. Presence discreet but unmistakable to those who watched for trouble. The runner spoke quietly to 3 households in succession, making notes in a small leather book. Routine inquiry after public street accidents. No more. Yet when he turned toward Lady Harrow, she stiffened almost imperceptibly and signalled Catherine with 2 fingers. "Come," Lady Harrow said through her smile. Catherine followed in to a side salon where the music dimmed behind closed doors. Mirrors doubled the candles. The runner stood waiting beside an escritoire, hat in hand. He bowed to Lady Harrow first, then to Catherine with neutral courtesy. "Madam, Miss, routine statements concerning the Berkeley Square carriage incident." Lady Harrow spoke before he could continue. "My companion saw little. She was indoors most of the time." Catherine felt the old reflex press against her throat. Agree, survive, endure. She heard again the scratch of Lady Harrow's pen over lies in the attic. She saw Reeds shaking hands around stale bread. The runner turned to her. "Miss Ivanov, where were you when the groom was injured?" "In the courtyard," she said. "At his side." Lady Harrow's fan snapped open. "Catherine is distressed. She confuses sequence." Catherine kept her eyes on the runner. "The groom was not intoxicated. He was trapped under the carriage step. I freed the bracket. His Grace ordered the surgeon. Mr. Fenwick can confirm." The runner's pen paused, then resumed. "Did you observe recklessness by the Duke of Norwood's driver?" "No," Lady Harrow's voice sharpened. "You overstep, girl." Catherine answered without turning. "I answer what I witnessed, my lady." The runner wrote 3 more lines, blotted the page, and looked between them with professional caution. "Thank you. Statement recorded." Lady Harrow smiled at him with brittle charm. "Surely an oral note is sufficient. No need to trouble the magistrate with servant confusion." Catherine spoke before he could. I am prepared to sign. Lady Harrow swung toward her, silk hissing. You are prepared to embarrass your family in public. My family has been embarrassed by false books for years, Catherine said very quietly. Truth is merely new to the room. The runner, to his credit, pretended deafness to everything but process. He set paper on the escritoire, turned it for her, and offered the pen. Catherine stepped forward. Her right hand would not obey cleanly, so she took the pen in her left and wrote, with slow, deliberate strokes, Catherine Ivanov. The letters leaned slightly, but they held. When she set the pen down, she sensed rather than saw movement at the salon doorway. She turned. Norwood stood beyond the threshold, half obscured by shadow and candle glare, as if he had arrived a minute earlier and chosen not to interrupt. His expression gave nothing away, only his stillness changed. Absolute. Watchful, the Colonel and Parliament men were gone. He had come alone. The runner gathered his notes, bowed, and withdrew. Lady Harrow held her smile in place until the door shut, then let it drop. You reckless, ungrateful child! Norwood stepped into the salon before Lady Harrow could advance. He did not touch either woman. He merely occupied the space between them and made it clear there would be no crossing. Enough, he said. Lady Harrow's laugh was thin. You presume a great deal for a man who insists on presenting strangers as kin. Norwood did not look at her. His eyes remained on Catherine's face, then on the faint powder smeared over the reddening mark at her cheek. His jaw tightened. The scar pulled white. To the floor, Lady Harrow, he said. Your daughters are being discussed in your absence. The insult was surgical, perfectly polite, socially annihilating. Lady Harrow drew herself up, gathered her fan and composure, and swept out without curtsy or farewell, leaving lavender and threat in her wake. Silence settled. Music throbbed through the wall in distant waves. Catherine stared at the written statement drying on the desk blotter, at her own name tilting left like a mast in crosswind. You heard all of it. Yes. You waited. Yes. She turned to him then, anger and humiliation, and something more dangerous burning together beneath her ribs. Why? Because if I spoke too soon, she would call it coercion. His voice stayed level. Now she cannot. He took one step closer. Not enough to touch, enough that she could see the fine spray of candlelight in his grey-blue eyes. You did precisely right, he said, at cost to yourself. No one had said that to her in 6 years. Her throat constricted around words she did not trust. It may cost more yet. It will, he said. Do it anyway. A footman appeared at the door, breathless with protocol. Your Grace, the next set is called. Norwood did not look away from Catherine. Tell them I am delayed. The footman bowed and vanished. Catherine drew a careful breath. Lady Harrow will punish Reed for speaking. Reed is under my protection, as of tonight. She will punish the maids for seeing. I have already retained 2 of them for temporary service at Norwood House. They leave at dawn with references. She blinked. The speed of his preparation unsettled her more than anger would have. You anticipated this? I anticipated her. The music shifted beyond the wall, strings climbing toward a refrain she had mended gowns to witness and never shared. In the mirrored salon, under too many candles, with her cheek stinging and her hand wrapped in linen, Catherine felt the balance of the room tilt by one hard degree, not into safety, into possibility. Norwood extended his uninjured hand, palm up, an offer made in command form. Come back into the room. She looked at the hand, then at his face. As your cousin, his answer came without hesitation. As the woman who told the truth when it was expensive. Catherine did not take his hand at once. The candles hissed in their glass cups. Music swelled through the wall, bright and indifferent. His palm stayed open between them, steady, waiting without softness and without retreat, as if refusal would alter nothing except the degree of difficulty. She set her bandaged hand in his. His fingers closed carefully around the linen, avoiding pressure where the skin was torn. He led her from the side salon into the crush of the ballroom, not with the flourish of a gentleman displaying a conquest, but with the exact pace of a commander moving an injured soldier through smoke. Conversation thinned as they crossed the threshold. Fans slowed. A pair of dowagers turned in unison. The room had witnessed her standing against walls for seasons. It had never seen the Duke of Norwood walk beside her, as if position had already been decided and only the paperwork remained. He stopped near the edge of the dance floor where the light fell cleanest. "Stand here," he said. She heard herself answer, "Yes, Your Grace," and hated the tremor in her own voice. A lord with silver at his temples approached first, smiling with practised warmth. "Norwood, you vanish for half an hour and return with mystery." Norwood did not glance at Catherine before he spoke. "My cousin, Miss Ivanov." The title struck her like cold rain at the back of the neck. Habit rose, sharp and automatic. "I am not your cousin." She opened her mouth. His gaze shifted to her. Only that. No visible warning. No plea. But she saw the same contained force she had seen at the broken carriage wheel, a man holding weight in place by sheer refusal to let it move. She closed her mouth. The lord bowed to her, uncertain and suddenly respectful. "Miss Ivanov." Norwood dismissed him with a fractional nod. Another set of introductions followed. A viscountess in lilac feathers, a colonel with a waxed moustache, a banker who looked as if he measured people by collateral. Each time Norwood used the same words. "My cousin, Miss Ivanov." Each time Catherine felt the lie scrape against truth. Each time she swallowed correction until her throat burned. Lady Harrow watched from 10 yards away, daughters bracketing her like polished ornaments. The smile she wore for society had begun to crack at the edges. A footman appeared with a silver tray of champagne flutes. Norwood lifted one glass and handed it to Catherine. "Drink." "I do not drink," she obeyed. The wine was dry and cold. It steadied her less than the command did. He signalled the same footman back with 2 fingers. "Food," the man blinked once. "Your Grace, supper is not yet announced." "Then raid the supper room." "Yes, Your Grace." Catherine kept her eyes on the dance floor, on the turning pairs and white gloves and satin skirts. "You cannot order another household's servants as if they were your own." "I can, when they choose to obey." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one that matters tonight." The footman returned with a plate balanced in both hands. Bread, slices of cold pheasant, a wedge of tart. Norwood took it, passed it to Catherine, and waited. She did not move. His voice lowered. "If you faint in this room, Lady Harrow will narrate the cause before your head reaches the floor. Eat." She broke bread with her left hand and forced herself to chew. Around them, conversation resumed in guarded streams, never quite rising to its earlier volume. Norwood remained beside her, motionless enough to look carved from darker stone than the ballroom columns. Men came to claim his attention. He gave each no more than a sentence and returned his focus to the room in widening circles, doorways, corridor mouths, the side salon they had left, Lady Harrow's position, then Catherine again. Watchfulness as discipline, not affection, not yet anything she could name without error. By the time the second dance began, she had eaten half the plate, and the shaking in her knee had eased. He took the empty dish from her and handed it to a passing servant. "Good!" The single word landed with unreasonable force. Praise had been rationed out of her life so thoroughly that even this blunt acknowledgement loosened something tight in her chest. Lady Harrow approached at last, silk whispering, fans snapping open and closed with tiny sounds like restrained applause. "Your Grace, you have been monopolised. Miss Ivanov forgets that she is here to assist me." Norwood faced her without bowing. "She is occupied." "With what, precisely?" "With being visible." Lady Harrow laughed softly, a sound made for nearby ears. "You are determined to tease. I am determined to prevent interference with an active statement." Her fan stilled. "I beg your pardon?" "The Bow Street Runner has her signed account. Any attempt to alter it now will be read as obstruction. I would advise caution in the choice of your next words, Lady Harrow." Catherine felt the air leave her lungs. He had not merely witnessed, he had moved pieces while she was still deciding whether she dared touch one. Lady Harrow recovered her smile by force. "You speak as if this were a criminal proceeding." Norwood's expression did not change. "It is becoming one." Eliza stepped forward before her mother could answer. "Mother, Lady Ashcombe is calling." Lady Harrow held Norwood's gaze one beat too long, then inclined her head. "Enjoy your masquerade, Your Grace." She turned away, daughters swirling after her, lavender trailing like a warning written in scent. Catherine released the breath she had been holding. "Oh, you arranged that?" "Yes." "When?" "Yesterday, and this afternoon, and again an hour ago." "For me?" "For the record." She looked up at him. "That is not the same thing." His jaw tightened. The scar pulled white. "No." The musicians shifted into a quadrille. Pairs assembled. A gentleman she did not know approached, bowed to Norwood, and offered his hand to Catherine with polite confidence. "May I claim this set, Miss Ivanov?" She hesitated. Norwood answered first. "No." The gentleman blinked, then tried to laugh. "I was under the impression ladies decide such matters." "Not this one, not now." Catherine found her voice. "Your Grace, that is not your choice. It is while your hand is bandaged and half this room is hungry for spectacle." The gentleman bowed again, embarrassed and stiff. "Of course." He retreated into the crowd. Heat rose in Catherine's face, anger braided with something that felt dangerously like relief. "You are impossible." Norwood's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "So I am told." He stepped aside as if to grant her space to leave him, but he did not depart. He stood at her shoulder and watched dancers complete the first figure. One turn, two, a bow, white gloves flashing under candlelight. She said quietly, "You have introduced me as your cousin at every room where anyone important was listening." "Yes." "I corrected you each time." "Yes." "Why persist in a falsehood that humiliates us both?" A long silence followed. The music filled it. Voices rose and fell like distant surf against stone. When he answered, his tone was the same one he used for battlefield facts and carriage orders. "Because your stepmother could dismiss a servant. She could isolate a poor relation. She could not openly strike at kin, acknowledged by a duke, without drawing the exact attention she depends on avoiding." Catherine stared at the dancers because looking directly at him felt like stepping off a height in darkness. "You used rank as shield." "I used the only shield she respects." "And my consent?" He did not answer quickly. That, more than any explanation, told her he understood the wound. "I judged that apology later was less costly than your ruin now." Her throat tightened. "You judged for me." "Yes." Honesty that severe left no room for easy forgiveness. Yet, beneath anger, she felt the precise shape of what he had done, not gallantry, not flirtation, not the careless possession men performed for sport. He had built her a legal perimeter out of his name and stood inside it with her while people watched. Across the room, a cluster formed near the ballroom entrance. The Bow Street runner had returned, now accompanied by a narrow-faced clerk carrying a portfolio tied in red tape. The clerk spoke with the house major domo, then with an older gentleman in magistrate's black. Notes were exchanged. No one raised a voice. The movement was quiet and inexorable. Norwood followed her gaze. "Do not look alarmed. Look bored." She almost laughed and did not. "I have never been this exhausted in my life." "Good. Exhaustion reads as boredom at distance." "That is a terrible rule." "It is an effective one." A fresh couple glided too close, skirts brushing Catherine's hem. She shifted back instinctively. Norwood's hand came to the small of her back for one brief second, firm and warm through thin muslin, guiding her away from the crush. He removed it at once. The place where he had touched her burned as if the fabric held heat. He gave an order without looking down. "Sit. There are no chairs." He turned his head. A footman appeared within moments carrying a gilt chair from the card-room, with the speed of someone who had learned not to ask why. Norwood placed it himself against the wall, angled so she could see both the dance floor and the entrance corridor. Catherine stared at the absurdity of it. A throne of borrowed gold in the margin where she had always stood. "This will cause comment." "It has already caused comment." She sat. He remained standing beside her. Minutes stretched. One quadrille ended, another began. He did not move away, though men repeatedly approached with invitations, petitions, and social obligations clothed as pleasantries. He refused each with 2 sentences or less. No, later, not tonight. The duration became its own declaration. Powerful men did not stand guard over inconvenient women in crowded ballrooms unless something in them had already shifted beyond retrieval. By the time the 3rd quadrille was called, the magistrate's clerk had crossed the room and spoken twice with the runner, once with Norwood's steward, and once with a solicitor Catherine recognised from Chancery steps. Papers changed hands. Seals were inspected under candlelight. A list was checked against another list. Every action was small. Every action was final. Catherine watched the process and felt terror and vindication rise together until she could barely separate one from the other. "If those ledgers become evidence," she whispered, "they may charge me for concealment before they charge her for fraud." Norwood looked down at her. "Yes." "You say that as if it does not concern you." "It concerns me precisely. It is why I needed your statement first. Intent matters. Sequence matters. You did not hide books for gain. You preserved records until corroboration existed." She blinked. "How do you know what I preserved?" His answer came like a door opening in a wall she had believed solid. "Because Mrs. Davies sent copies to my steward each Monday since Michaelmas, routine household account copies, and requisition duplicates you already handled publicly. Nothing from your hidden cache. Your private discrepancy ledger and codicil notes remained concealed under your cot, unknown outside your own keeping. Because Fenwick confirmed the bruises were patterned. Because I had your father's last shipping abstracts pulled from Admiralty Archive and matched against Harrow claims. Because I have been watching every room they put you in and every corridor they forced you to use." Her pulse kicked hard against her ribs. "Mrs. Davies offered unasked. I accepted." Catherine gripped the chair arms until her knuckles ached. All those nights with candle stubs, all those columns written in secrecy, and someone had seen. Someone had believed the numbers before she could prove them in public. "Why?" she said, barely above breath. "Did you not tell me?" "Because if you knew the full scope, Lady Harrow would have read it on your face." His eyes held hers with uncompromising steadiness. "You are honest to the point of danger, Miss Ivanoff. It is your greatest strength and your most exploitable weakness." The words should have cut. They did. They also felt like recognition so exact it left her unsteady. Music swelled, strings bright as glass. Around them the ballroom turned in ordered figures, all grace and varnished certainty. At the edges, Law moved in plain coats and ink-stained fingers. At her side, the Duke of Norwood stood so still he might have rooted himself to the floorboards. He spoke without looking away from the entrance where the magistrate now conferred with the Devonshire host. "Hear me carefully," she waited. "Do not leave this room without me. Do not sign any paper, not placed in your hand by the runner, the magistrate, or me. Do not answer private questions in corridors. If Lady Harrow corners you, you say only this: 'My statement is on record.' Nothing else." It was command language, battlefield language. Yet beneath each order sat the same unadorned fact. He intended her to survive what came next. Catherine rose slowly from the chair because sitting while he stood felt suddenly intolerable. She was close enough now to see the faint line of fatigue at the corners of his eyes, the pallor beneath weathered skin, the effort held in his shoulders as if restraint itself weighed as much as armour. "I have corrected you in every room," she said. "Yes." She held his gaze and heard her own heartbeat, hard and uneven, beneath violins and conversation. "Not tonight." For the first time since she had known him, he closed his eyes for a single measured breath, as if that answer had struck somewhere he had kept barricaded for years. When he opened them again, the winter in them had not melted, but it had cracked. "Stay," he said. She stayed. The clock above the musicians struck 1, and the sound passed through the chandeliers like iron through glass. Morning, by law, if not by light. Norwood turned his head toward the entrance, saw the magistrate lift a hand, and made his decision with the same brutal economy he brought to every field command. "Come with me," he said. He did not wait for argument. He moved through the edge of the crowd 1 pace ahead, clearing a narrow path with nothing but presence. Catherine followed because standing still had become the more dangerous choice. He led her through a card room, then into a small library where only 4 people waited: the Bow Street magistrate in black, the narrow-faced clerk with the red-taped portfolio, a grey-haired chaplain in plain bands, and Mrs. Davies, still in her kitchen dress beneath a borrowed shawl, hands folded hard around her apron. Catherine stopped on the threshold. "What is this?" Norwood faced her fully. Candlelight cut his face into planes of stone and fatigue. "The crux is simple. Lady Harrow can attempt to remove you before dawn and lock every paper behind her solicitor's privilege. If you stand alone tonight, she will call you dependent, unstable, coached." His voice did not soften. "If you stand as my wife, she cannot touch your person, your rooms, or your documents without criminal exposure." Her pulse hammered in her throat. "You planned this." "I planned contingencies." He held her gaze. "I did not force this one." The magistrate spoke then, formal and level. "Miss Ivanoff, you are of full age. You may decline. If you accept, I witness free consent." Catherine looked at Mrs. Davies. The older woman's eyes were wet and steady at once. She gave 1 small nod. Not pressure, recognition. Norwood spoke again, clipped and exact. "Marry me now. We can discuss every tenderness and every term later. Tonight is about survival and truth on record." Catherine drew breath that hurt all the way down. She thought of the attic key at her neck, the ledger under the false board, the slap, the paper she had refused, the years erased and renamed by people with better fabric and louder voices. Then she thought of Reed's shaking hand around stale bread, and of Norwood standing still beside her for 3 quadrilles, while Law assembled at the edges. "Yes," she said. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. The chaplain's words were spare. The vows were unadorned and legally complete. Catherine's left hand shook when she signed the register. Norwood's did not. Mrs. Davies signed as witness with blunt kitchen fingers and a legal mark she had practised in secret. The magistrate sealed the page. The clerk sanded the ink and closed the book. When it was done, Norwood offered his arm. "Back to the floor." They returned to light and music, as if they had only stepped out to speak of weather. Lady Harrow saw them at once. She crossed the ballroom with both daughters behind her, silk rushing around her ankles, fan rigid in her grip. She did not lower her voice. "There you are. Convenient." Her smile flashed white and thin. "My Lord Magistrate, I must request immediate removal of this girl. She has stolen private household ledgers and attempted to extort my family under my own roof." A ring of faces widened around them. Dancers stalled in place. The musicians faltered, then died into silence, one instrument at a time. Catherine stepped forward before fear could fix her feet to the floor. She drew a flat linen packet from inside her mantle, where it had rested all evening against her ribs like a second heartbeat. "These are not stolen," she said. "They are mine. They include my father's books, household copies in my hand, duplicated invoices, and the receipt for my dowry pearls sold without legal authority." She placed the packet in the magistrate's hands. Her fingers were cold and steady. "I concealed them," she said to the room, and the words cost her more than any humiliation she had endured in silence. "For months. I did so to verify every figure before I spoke, because accusation without proof is noise. Charge me for concealment if you must, but read the books." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Lady Harrow laughed too loudly. "You hear her? She admits deceit. Even the Duke only dares call her cousin." Catherine felt the old reflex rise, the one that corrected false entries before ink dried. Norwood stepped between them, not touching either woman, and his voice cut clean through the room. "Stop correcting me." He turned to the onlookers, to the magistrate, to every polished witness who had watched Catherine stand hungry against walls, and called it propriety. "Good. I married her this morning." Silence struck the ballroom flat. For one suspended breath, Catherine could not feel her own body. The words hung in the candlelight, raw and irreversible. Then the magistrate opened the red-taped portfolio. He withdrew a folded vellum sheet sealed in old wax, the Ivanov crest intact, recovered hours earlier by warrant from the false lining of Lady Harrow's jewelled reticule. "Codicil to Captain Alexei Ivanov's will," he read. "Filed copy missing from chambers. Original now presented." He broke the seal and read in a measured voice that carried to the mirrors. "I name my daughter Catherine Ivanov, sole heir to Whitcomb's school lands, shipping residuals, and associated accounts. I appoint any remarried guardian as trustee in care only, with no power of sale, transfer, or encumbrance. Any debt entered against these assets without beneficiary signature shall be deemed falsification." Lady Harrow went white beneath powder. Eliza made a strangled sound. Anne began to weep without tears. The magistrate lowered the page. "Lady Harrow, you are under formal warrant for fraud, coercion, and attempted subornation of perjury. You will come peacefully." 2 Bow Street officers stepped forward from the crowd. Lady Harrow drew herself up, all lavender and steel. "This is social murder." "No," Catherine said, her voice very quiet in the charged hush. "It is accounting." The officers took Lady Harrow by the arms. She did not struggle. Her silk rustled as they led her from the ballroom, and the sound was dry as winter leaves. Eliza stood frozen, then looked at Catherine with the same bright cruelty she had worn for years, only now stripped of confidence. "You planned this." Catherine met her gaze. "I endured it." Anne turned away first. Neither sister followed their mother. By the third morning after Devonshire, rain had cleared from Whitcombe and left the air bright and cold. Catherine stood in the shuttered schoolhouse her father had built for sailors' daughters, sleeves rolled, dust on her skirt. The old map from his sea trunk spread across the front wall, where sunlight could reach it. Desks had been scrubbed, slates stacked. A new coal scuttle waited full beside the grate. Mrs. Davies carried in a basket of bread and apples and set it down with practical triumph. Reed, pale but upright with his arm in a proper sling, wrestled a crate of copybooks through the door and grinned when he saw Catherine watching. "Fenwick says no stable duty for a fortnight," he said, "so his Grace said I may do sums instead." "You may do both badly until you practice," Catherine said, and Reed laughed. At noon, the first 3 girls arrived, boots muddy, hair ribboned with care that did not hide poverty. They stopped at the threshold when they saw Norwood in the room, tall and severe in dark coat, as out of place among ink-pots and chalk as a warship in a village stream. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. Catherine knelt so her face was level with theirs. "You are not late," she said. "You are first." They entered. That evening, at a small supper in Norwood House, attended by trustees, solicitor and 2 local rectors, Norwood stood when Catherine came into the drawing-room. Conversation dropped by instinct. He said it plainly, without flourish, as if he were entering a fact into permanent record. "My wife, the Duchess of Norwood." No one laughed. No one looked away. Later, when the guests were gone and only firelight moved against the high walls, Catherine stood at the window with her father's compass in her palm, recovered from the Harrow display shelf and polished clean. Norwood waited a respectful distance behind her, giving her the space to decide whether this was still a marriage of emergency or the beginning of something chosen. She turned. "Why the word cousin for so long?" He did not pretend confusion. "Because I needed time to gather proof before Lady Harrow could destroy you, and because open courtship would have warned her to burn what remained." "You could have told me." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "I chose silence. I judged the trade-off and made it." She studied him, this man who had never offered pretty comfort, and had instead offered structure, risk, and his name where law could see it. "And now I answer when you ask." The fire settled with a soft crack. Outside, wind moved through bare branches. Inside, nothing was hidden any more. The ledgers submitted, the codicil entered, the false affidavit seized, the runner's report filed, the doctor's notes attached, the reticule search logged, the missing coal fraud traced, the school deed restored. Catherine set the compass on the mantel between them and stepped closer. He waited. She laid her hand, still faintly bandaged, against his coat at the centre of his chest, where his heart struck hard and steady under wool and linen. "Then hear mine," she said. "We rebuild with truth. No protective lies, no renamed rooms, no invisible labour." His answer came at once. "Yes." At the next public assembly, when introductions began and the old world leaned forward to see whether language would bend again, Norwood inclined his head toward her and said, "The Duchess of Norwood?" Catherine did not correct him.